the top most inspirational nurse leaders and one of the top 50 BME pioneers. And in 2017, she was included in the HSJ, you'll have to help me with the acronyms when you start speaking, a top 100 influential leaders list. So needless to say, Yvonne is so kind to join us in the evening time from her UK home. And we're sorry that you couldn't make the trip across the water to Canada. We really had wished to be able to do this in person, but Zoom will have to do. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to you, Yvonne, and thank you very much for coming and speaking with us today.
Well, Sabrina, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's very kind of you. The HSJ is the Health Service Journal, by the way. It is the journal that people in England turn to and look to for anything to do with healthcare. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak about the work that I've been doing in England over a period of 43 years. I have been a nurse since 1977, and I suppose I will always be a nurse. But it's my great pleasure to be here and to speak on this 52nd Marion Woodward lecture. And I'm going to be talking today to all of you about race inequality and the race inequalities in our English NHS, and how COVID has brought some of that, quite a lot of that, to life. So I'm just going to share my screen with you now and commence the presentation. You will know that the English NHS is an organisation that is the 5th biggest employer in the world. We have 1.5 million people working in our NHS, and 750,000 of them are nurses. It is a free at the point of need service, which means that people pay through their taxes to have healthcare when they need it and when it is necessary. And I'm going to be talking to you this evening about race equality in the English NHS, as well as how COVID has impacted on people in this country, in England, and what we're doing about some of that at the moment. So within the NHS, we have something called the Constitution. The NHS started back in 1948, and Irene Bevin started the NHS. And it was at that time that it was decided that care should be free at the point of need, so that people wouldn't have to pay for their care, regardless of their wealth or lack of wealth. You were entitled to a high quality service. This constitution that we have is kind of the objectives of the NHS, the Bible, what we live by. And the first principle of our constitution is this. It talks about, irregardless of people's gender, their race, their disability, their age, they're entitled to high quality patient care, patient safety, and patient satisfaction, that we will treat everybody equitably and everybody well. And that we have a public sector duty to make sure that everybody, regardless of who they are and where they've come from, actually has high quality care. And that we, as one of the biggest organizations in the world, should be promoting inclusion, diversity, and making sure that everybody has a good experience, if it's the end of their life, or if it's the beginning of their life, or any time in between. That's what the NHS is in business to do. And I think it's really important that people remember this, and specifically around race equality. So why is race equality important in our NHS? And I would argue that it's probably important across the rest of the world as well. But for many, many, many years, it was just ignored and people didn't take very much notice of it. People from different parts of the world have been working in our NHS since 1948. And actually, we have 20% of our workforce from all over the world. And in England, the acronym BME, Black and Minority Ethnic Back, or BAME, B-A-M-E, is used quite a lot to describe this group of people who are from various backgrounds, so Black, Asian and minority ethnic people, or Black and minority ethnic people. But back in 2009, which is really quite recent actually, two professors, Jeremy Dawson and Professor Michael West, did a piece of work, and they actually found this. And it was actually quite revolutionary at its time, because what they found was that the greater proportion of staff from Black or minority ethnic backgrounds who reported experiencing discrimination at work in the previous 12 months, the lower the levels of patient satisfaction. And that was really very, very important, because up to that point, we did not have the evidence about the fact that patient care and how Black and ethnic minority staff were treated were inextricably linked. So it was really important that we got that work. We saw that work. They went on to say that the experience of this group of staff was a very good barometer in terms of care for everybody in the organization, of care and respect. So this was really groundbreaking, because what was being said was, actually, if you treat your staff from different backgrounds really well, it actually is a barometer of how other people are treated within your organization and how well they are treated. And I think that was I think, probably the turning point in terms of race equality in our NHS. So the benefits that were said within that report were quite substantial. First of all, we know that it's about having a fair and equitable system, and everybody would agree that morally it is absolutely the right thing to do to treat everybody fairly and well. The important thing was about patient care and patient satisfaction, as well as it being one of our public sector equality duties. But I think what was really interesting in that report was the fact that what was said was that for every one standard deviation point of increased engagement in an organisation, there were 2.4% less deaths in acute trusts. That was absolutely phenomenal, as well as for every one standard deviation point of increased engagement, there being £150,000 in savings, based on savings of agency staff and making sure that staff weren't absent. Because the better you're treated, obviously, the more likely you are to come to work. You're not going to take as much time off sick. You're not going to be so stressed, and so on. So the benefits of race equality were coming to the fore, and people were beginning to realize that this was incredibly important. This is something that we needed to do. As well as that, what was found also in 2013, when Sir Robert Francis did some work on an organisation called Mid Staffordshire Hospital, where they found that things weren't going very well for patients, was that staff from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds and from ethnic backgrounds were less likely to speak up and say to their employers when things were wrong, for fear that actually it would backfire on them and they would be the ones that would be ostracized. And that was really important, because what that meant was that if staff saw something going wrong, or things were going wrong in the organization, they wouldn't speak up. And that would impact on patient care. Because if you saw that something was happening to a patient and you were frightened to speak up and say to your managers or your leaders, actually this is happening, then actually that could compromise patient care. So it was really serious stuff that was going on, and we really had to take notice of all of our staff in the NHS, but we had to start paying more attention to staff from different backgrounds, which probably before 2009 was not something that people took particularly seriously. Recently, I did a piece of work in London as the lead for race equality in London. London, as you probably know, has a 50-50 population in terms of people from white backgrounds and people from non-white backgrounds. And in our health service across London, most of the organisations, and there are 36 big foundation trusts, which are our big hospitals, there is not a hospital that has less than 30% of its workforce from ethnic backgrounds. So quite substantial numbers of people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. And we did this piece of work, and the piece of work was really important because what we're aiming to do is to make sure that people who are from different backgrounds have the same experiences as their white counterparts. And I'll talk a bit about that a little bit later on. But what the staff were actually saying, I brought together a group of staff, nurses, doctors, physios, across the board, managers, and this is what the staff who were not from white backgrounds were saying that they wanted from their health service. They wanted to have senior decision makers who looked like them. And they also wanted who would make choices that didn't advantage them and their future, which tells you something about what people were feeling. And that the leaders that don't look like me would be understanding, authentic, and committed to inclusion through their actions and how they speak, and that their difference would be valued. They wanted it to be a buzzing place to work where everyone would feel uplifted and part of a shared vision to deliver high quality care. Now, I think that this vision that they pulled together for the London Workforce Race Equality Strategy is a vision that we all want, regardless of where we are in the country or where we are in the world indeed. I think everybody would like to have a vision or a strategy that's very much like this. The thing that we're dealing with, and you all probably know this, is global. Race inequality is a global issue, and in white majority countries like the US, UK, the country that you guys are in at the moment, Australia and New Zealand, we have so much evidence that shows that people from non-white backgrounds have poorer health, wealth, housing, the judiciary, across the board. So it's really important that people understand that it isn't an issue that you can deal with very, very quickly or just flip it on its head and race inequality will go away. It's something that is hardwired into our societies globally. And the less melanin you have in your skin, the better your life chances will be. And we have so much evidence now that actually shows that that's absolutely the case. And these slides that I'm going to show you just very, very quickly illustrate that in terms of life expectancy across many countries. And the data that I'm going to show you is it's not older data. This is data that is less than 10 years old. So we know that this is still happening within our society. We know that in our NHS at the moment, if you are from a Black background, you are 40 times more likely per 100,000 to die during your pregnancy than if you are from other backgrounds. And interestingly, here, people from Chinese backgrounds actually are less likely to die than anybody. But you can see why it is the Black Lives Matter is something that has risen right to the very, very top of the agenda as far as this is concerned. And over and above this, this is not just about maternal deaths. This is also about the women dying, yes, but also their babies as well. You're more likely to lose your baby if you are from a Black or Asian background than if you are from a white background in our country. In England, as we speak, we know that if you are from all other different backgrounds, you will make less money for your household than if you come from a white background. This is data from 2029 through to 2013, and it shows very, very clearly that if you are from a non-white background, things are very, very different for you than from your white counterparts. Now, the work that I was doing, actually, we broke down the data to look at what was going on in our NHS for our non-white staff in terms of their satisfaction of working in the NHS and whether they believed that there was equal opportunities. And this is important because if our staff do not feel cared for, if they do not feel valued, if they do not feel appreciated, it's very, very difficult for them to continue caring. And what we found, and this is 2020 data actually, that compared to white staff, the people of colour, and particularly Black people, you can see from this slide, felt that actually they were not being given equal opportunities. And because they weren't being given the equal opportunities, the concern and the worry was about how they were feeling and how they were feeling in terms of providing high quality patient care and patient safety and patient satisfaction. And I think that that is particularly important at this time when we're talking about COVID. So back in March actually, when the country went down into lockdown, we found out very, very quickly that certain people were actually much more at risk than other people. And I think that that was global. But what was happening for us in England particularly, were that people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds were actually disproportionately becoming sick and dying. And we actually saw that within our workforce as well. We saw that within our nursing workforce, and we saw that within our medical workforce. We saw that within cleaners and people who were on the front line. And it was actually very sobering. It was incredibly sobering. And for me particularly, I lost two really close colleagues from COVID very, very early on, which was a surprise to me because they were both medics and both of them were healthy, and you would not have guessed that they were the people that would have contracted this disease or succumbed to it. So it was really quite shocking. But it was an important time, because what we began to see was that disproportionately people of colour, people from ethnic backgrounds were becoming much more susceptible to the virus and dying from the virus than others. That, alongside people who were men, people who had comorbidities and so on and so forth. These were the people who we were beginning to look at. So a piece of work was done to look at what was going on in our society around the COVID risks, because obviously we needed to protect people. And you can see from this slide that if you were from a Black background and you were a Black male, you were 3 times, nearly 4 times more likely to actually succumb to COVID than if you were from a white background. And even with comorbidities and where you live, houses of multiple occupancy to being taken into place, you were still 2 times more likely to succumb. So something was going on for people of colour, and the scientists and others the researchers wanted to find out what that was. Those of us who work in the field of race inequality knew perfectly well what it was, but it was very, very difficult to get people to accept and acknowledge that. And I think that even today, it is a very, very difficult thing for people to acknowledge that there are these gaping inequalities, and that discrimination and racism actually causes people to be physiologically compromised, and actually it doesn't help in terms of their physical health, and they become more susceptible. And we have evidence to show that that is exactly the case. This slide just shows you the numbers of people, the numbers of nurses and midwives who succumbed. It is old data now, and we know now that we have over 600 people who are doctors and nurses and healthcare workers and so on that have succumbed to the virus in the first wave. And of course, we are now going into a second wave, and I just heard earlier today that more places in this country are going into what they call tier 3, which is lockdown. So it's not a total blanket lockdown of the country, but various areas, and particularly in the north of the country, are going into tier 3, which is lockdown. We're also hearing that many more people are succumbing to the virus, and our hospitals are filling up fast, which means that there's going to be another impact on our already very tired, very fearful workforce. So, one of the things that I was talking about earlier on the panel was how we look after our staff, how we look after our nurses, how we look after our frontline workers who are going to have to go through this situation again. And hopefully we would have learned the lessons from the last time in order to help them. And these are just a few of the clinicians that we have lost in this country. And I, for one, always put up a slide to show these people who have actually given their lives to make sure that others live, because they are, in my view, heroes. Amongst this group of people are doctors and nurses, as well as healthcare assistants. And as I said, there are many, many more of them now that have lost their lives. And it's such a sadness to me that this is the case, because as somebody said to me recently, none of us come to work to die. None of us come to work to lose our lives. And so there's a responsibility on all of us who are in leadership positions to protect all of our staff. And I think that's really, really important. Now, getting back to the point that I was making earlier about racism and how it actually impacts on people's physiological health, and how it's not one of the things that we're really talking about very much here. And indeed, over the last couple of weeks, we've had people saying in very high level positions in the government that categorically it can't be racism that's causing these problems. I would beg to differ. Because what we know is that racism is an organised and very sophisticated system. It's incredibly sophisticated, actually. It's probably one of the most successful systems that has been ever put into place in the world over many, many, many years. And it works very well to devalue and disempower and differentially allocating opportunities and resources. So, you know, the nearer you are to what is deemed normal, which is white, the better things will be for you globally. And then, of course, it's underpinned by this ideology of the inferiority of some groups, the out groups. And that is the thing, I think, that leads to the prejudice and the stereotypes, and ultimately to the discrimination. It's really important that people understand how that works and how it impacts on people and their lives. Because to be honest with you, what it causes is all of this. And all of these things are discriminatory and they impact on people across the board. And people will have heard that they're called microaggressions, microassaults, whatever it is. The drip, drip, drip feeding of "you're not good enough" into somebody's psyche actually doesn't only have an impact on their psychological health, it actually has an impact on their physiological health. And how it has that impact is through this. We know that we have these telomeres at the end of our DNA and at the end of our chromosomes. And what has been found by Arlene Geronimus, sociologist, in lots of work that she has done, is that these telomeres shorten. And she found that the telomeres were shortening in Black women much more than they were in white women, meaning that at the same chronological age, Black women biologically were 7 years older. Their bodies were 7 years older. They were more compromised and more able and more susceptible to disease. I think that's a really important thing to remember, because people don't talk about this very much, that it's not just a psychological, but it's a physiological impact that discrimination has on people. Because the drip, 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 drip of "you're not good enough," these stressors, these strains that people have on them, causes people to be to wear out, really. And that's why it's called biological weathering. It ages people more rapidly. It means that you're more compromised, that you haven't got the resilience to fight off disease as much as your white counterparts. And some of this has got to be part of why we're seeing the disproportionate number of people getting COVID and also dying from COVID. That, along with the lack of vitamin D, which is the other thing that people don't talk about very much and needs to be looked into much more. And of course, these microaggressions that I'm talking about are everywhere, and they are sitting within our NHS. We are the biggest organisation in the world, as I said, and one of the biggest organisations in the world. And so we're a microcosm of society, and whatever happens in our NHS, in our country, happens in our NHS. And the feelings that we've had over the last, oh, I don't know, 4 years since we had the Brexit, and I won't be going into that thing going on in the country, has meant that people have felt much more othered and unwanted, and it's been a very difficult and very, very stressful time for people, and that cannot help how people feel and how it impacts on them physiologically as well as psychologically. So how does this impact on our staff in the NHS? I was responsible for a program called the Workforce Race Equality Standard. And one of the things that we did was measure the difference in experience between Black and ethnic minority staff and white staff. That was what we were in business to do. We had 9 indicators and we measured the difference. And you won't be surprised to know that for all of the 9 indicators that we measured, so things like, you know, are you likely to get a job from shortlisting? Are you likely to be put through the formal disciplinary processes? How does it feel for you? Are there equal opportunities in the organisation? On every single indicator, Black and ethnic minority staff said that they had a worse experience than their white counterparts. Over and above that, what you can see from this slide here is that even with the other protected characteristics that we have within our Equality Act, people from non-white backgrounds believed that they had been discriminated against much more than any of the other protected characteristics. And also, what was really interesting about this slide is that it's flatlined over the last 5 years. And in fact, it's got worse, excuse me, between 2018 and 2019, in that people do not feel that things are getting better. Now, if you cast your mind back to what I said at the very beginning about the fact that you can tell whether an organization, it's a barometer of whether things are really great in an organization and that people are well respected and so on and so forth from the work of Jeremy Dawson and Michael West. And then you look at this slide, you can see that there's a mismatch, and that quite a substantial number of people, workers in our NHS, including nurses, feel that they are being discriminated against and that they actually are not having the best time in our service. And that's important. And these are some of the things that happen during the working day, where people say they are, people call them jokes and banter, they can't pronounce their names properly, patients are verbally abusive, and I could talk to you all day about some of the experiences that staff say that they have had. All of these things impacting them in their working lives, making it much more difficult for them to give higher level patient care and making sure that patients are safe. Because if you're not cared for, it's very, very difficult to continue giving and caring. Hence, there are higher levels of sickness, there's higher levels of stress, going off with stress, leaving the organisation when we actually need to keep our staff. It is really important that we start to do things properly, because the disillusion, the unhappiness, the depression, and the lack of confidence in the system in our NHS today is profound. And that will obviously have an impact on patient care. And what the George Floyd issue has brought to the surface is a lot of this that I've been talking about for the last 15 years. But people are now realizing that unless we do things really differently for our staff, unless we start to acknowledge and believe that there is a difference in the way that they are treated, we're not going to be able to keep our staff, one. And secondly, we're not going to be able to give the patients the service that they need and deserve. So it's really important that we understand that. Now, when I talk about the dilemma of race equality in our NHS, this is just to put it into perspective, because I think people who aren't working in England might not understand or know how it works. We have such a big organisation, and the staff in our organisation come from all over the world, as I said, but many of our nurses and midwives are from non-white backgrounds. But when you look at the leadership of our organisations across the NHS, you'll see that very few people actually are from non-white backgrounds. And in nursing particularly, we only have 12 executive directors of nursing. Those are nurses that sit on the boards and make decisions about the services that are delivered in their organisations. And 12 out of nearly 700,000 nurses is not very many. And similarly, we have a similar picture with doctors, where there are 40% of doctors from non-white backgrounds in our NHS. This slide shows you very clearly the scale of the challenge that we have and what we have to do, because our non-white staff know this and they see this, and they know there aren't very many role models like them sitting at senior levels, and they know that they have to work twice as hard to get half as far, and they know that they're more likely to be discriminated against, and they know that actually they're less likely, they have to go for more jobs to get another job. So from that perspective, it means that they are going to be people that are feeling a little bit disgruntled and not as happy as they could with the situation. Layer on top of that COVID, and that the majority of our staff from those backgrounds are frontline workers, then you can see that it's a perfect storm for people to feel very unhappy about working in the NHS and being on the front line. These are just the indicators that we measure. These are, we do this every year. For the last 5 years, we've been collecting the data, looking at the different experiences of our staff of colour and our white staff, and actually comparing the data and seeing if we can work to close the gap on their experiences, so that our staff of colour have exactly the same experience as the white staff. And it's still a work in progress. And this slide shows you particularly nurses, midwives and health visitors by ethnicity, and where they're sitting in terms of their grades in our NHS at the moment. So the green line shows you the percentage of nurses and midwives and health visitors across the whole of the country. So just over 20, it's about 21%. And this then shows you the numbers into the percentages at the most senior levels. And as you go up to the highest levels, which are band 9s and very senior managers, you will see that fewer and fewer of our nursing and midwifery and health visiting staff come from ethnic backgrounds, but are overrepresented at band 5. Now, band 5, Agenda for Change, is where most nurses are at the coalface. So they actually are experiencing a higher viral load when it comes to COVID, because many more of them are at the coalface. So not only are more of them front-facing with patients, but they also know that they are less likely to be promoted, more likely to be discriminated against, more likely less likely to be sent on non-mandatory training. So it's all coming together, and that group of staff are feeling particularly disgruntled about their lot in our NHS. And so a lot of them prior to COVID left, and a lot of them now are thinking of leaving right in the middle of this pandemic, where we know we need as many nurses as we could possibly muster for the next wave. So there's something about us making sure that we understand and know what we need to do to keep these nurses on board whilst all of this is going on, because it is a very difficult and tricky time for everybody. These slides, I don't need to describe or tell you what these slides are saying. You can see very clearly for yourself, but you can also see where nurses from non-white backgrounds are sitting in terms of feeling that the trusts are giving them equal opportunities. You can see this one particularly, in the last 12 months, have you personally experienced discrimination at work from any of the following? And if you look at where our nurses are, you will see that it is a very, very high figure compared to their white counterparts across the board. So we have a real issue with fairness, with equity, with diversity in our NHS at the moment. And it's something that we really have to get to grips with. During the pandemic as well as after the pandemic, and to make sure that we understand what we need to do to make things better for this group of staff. And similarly, we have similar problems with our medics. It's not just nursing staff or managers, it's across the board, and it's not just in health, it's in lots of other professions as well that we see the very, very, very similar picture. Because as I said earlier, this is global. But we do have hope, and that's the good news. I think now that I've given you all the bad news and made you thoroughly depressed, there are strategies for improving. We know that we can make things better in our organisations, and though we can't necessarily boil the ocean and make things different across the whole of the world, we can change things in our organisations, and there are strategies that can improve some of the data that I've shown you. And on this slide, it shows you the things that have very little impact. For example, unconscious bias training, which has taken off throughout the whole of the world, which has practically no effect on changing systemic issues. Mentoring and networking, which everybody wants to do, they also have very modest effects. But the thing that has the most effect is the thing that people do very little of, which is to have mandatory programs of change, cultural change, with explicit authority given to some people to make those changes. There needs to be accountability, support from leadership, and developing psychologically safe spaces for staff. Really important that that happens, and that has been proven to be one of the most effective interventions that you could possibly have. And this is an evidence-based approach that I picked up from Dr. David Williams in Harvard University, who's the world expert on health and race. And these are the things that he believes need to happen in order for there to be race equality in organizations. And number one at the top of the list is leadership. We need to have leaders who are able to talk about race equality, who are able to support their organizations to do what they need to do, along with the accountability and having the data and the targets. Good communication strategies are absolutely key and really important, because if we don't have good communications, it means that people aren't going to understand or know what they need to do around all of this. And it's really, I can't stress it enough, important to have the right resources for the work, as well as celebrating the successes, along with cultural transformation and operational interventions, putting these things together and making sure you keep them going for at least 5 years will definitely produce change in your culture. And within that culture, you will make sure that your staff from all sorts of backgrounds have a better experience. But it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of energy, which is why I came up with the 7 A's. And I wrote this because I work with a lot of staff and a lot of people from all sorts of backgrounds. And my white colleagues are always saying to me, Yvonne, what do we do? How do we help? What is it we need to do? And I wrote this because actually these are the things that an ally needs to do in order to make sure that they become proper allies and are helpful in this space, as opposed to not. And the first of those A's is having the appetite to do something about, immersing yourself in the complex and emotive world of race equality. It is a quagmire, and people find it really difficult and hard to stay and be resilient in that space. And I think it's really important that people ask themselves those questions first. Do I really want to get involved in this? And will I stay the course? And do I have the energy to do all of this? And once you've answered that question, you then have to find out more about race equality, because there is a lot of ignorance around this agenda. People assume that they can make changes and they assume they know what to do. Be curious, read, educate yourself, learn, find out what does it really mean. And once you've done that, there's something about accepting for yourself that there is a problem with race inequality in our world before acknowledging openly and externally that yes, there is a problem, and you know, I can see that. The apology is about, you know, having sympathy for people who are not from white backgrounds, because their lives are very hard. Here you hear things like, well, what about white working class boys? And white working class boys do have a hard time. There's no ifs or buts about it. But if you are a black working class boy, your experiences are even worse. So it is about making sure that you understand and you know what the situation is around race, never assuming that you know, and then only then acting. And this has really taken off in the NHS. People have really liked this model of becoming an authentic ally, because it works for everything. It doesn't just work for race inequality, it works for all of the protected characteristics. So it's incredibly important. We have lots of challenges around this, and I think communication challenges are really key, and that people need to be aware of what's going on. And I think because of George Floyd, I'm already seeing the window of opportunity closing on the George Floyd thing, and people are not talking about it as much as they did. And I think people have lost the appetite, I think, for actually wanting to continue pushing against the door on this one in some places, not everywhere, but in a lot of places. So we really do need to continue building our science base as well as raising awareness. And we need to fill that empathy gap, because there's a great big gaping hole where people are not empathetic or don't care about some groups of our population and some people in our population. So there's some real challenges here, and some work that we all need to do globally to make sure that things stack up in terms of our societies. So the things that we've learned about this agenda are really important, and one of them is, and I've already stressed this, it's about compassionate leadership, but it's also about the fact that this thing called race inequality is everybody's agenda. It's not just to pass on to somebody who is the equality and diversity and inclusion lead. It's about making sure that all members of staff all across the organization understand what they need to do in order to make things better. It's really important that we think about that, and making sure we understand what the data is saying to us, and not purchasing, and people do this, expensive programs from consultancy firms that, you know, aren't going to make a difference when we actually have the answer. But the answer is hard work, doing that work that I've described, you know, constant leadership, looking at the data, making sure that everything stacks up, being in the space, takes effort and energy, and a lot of the time people don't want to do that, so they bring in consultancy firms to work on race equality, and they can forget all about it. And that's just not what needs to happen. We need to do things differently. So what I'm saying here is that the lessons that we have learned have shown me and shown others that we can make the changes that we need to make. There are organizations in England that have made substantial change to how their staff from Black and Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds feel about working in the organization. And what we have seen with that is that it transfers over into patient care, and patients are actually getting a better deal because staff from all backgrounds are feeling much more valued and appreciated. Just finally, it's just to say to you, this is what equity is not. It is not about leveling down. And I found this slide really quite shocking, and somebody sent this slide to me to say this is what you want to do, Yvonne. You want to actually make things worse for everybody. When actually what we're trying to do is to make things better for everybody. And this Black Lives Matter slide shows it very, very clearly. It isn't about Black people having a better life than everybody else. It's about making sure that everybody has a good life. And I think that that's part of the work that I've been doing for 15 or 16 years, is trying to get people to see that if you ensure that everybody is having a good experience and a better life, ultimately you get better outcomes for everybody, which is exactly what this slide is trying to say. We're trying to break down the barriers, doing things a bit differently for different groups of people, so that ultimately everybody has a good experience in our NHS, but more than that, in their lives generally, so that ultimately, if we're ever in this awful pandemic again, or anything like it, that we actually are able to not only psychologically cope with it, but for some of us physiologically cope with it as well. So thank you. I shall stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Yvonne. That was fantastic. So great. It's obviously sparked a lot of interest, and we have some questions that I'm going to ask of people. So the first question is around, what can we do as nurses to advocate for policy changes that will get at the systemic nature of racism?
I think nurses have got a fantastic role to play here, because we are at the front of making sure that all patients, regardless of backgrounds, have a good service. And if we know that if some of our fellow nurses aren't being treated appropriately or properly or well, it's incumbent on us to actually speak out and say that. And I fear that many of us don't speak out, we don't say anything, and that's not just people who are from white backgrounds, that's people of colour as well. So, I mean, I haven't spoken about the hierarchy of preference that we have in our NHS, but it exists because some people are preferred than others to be in higher level positions. And I think that unless we all start to speak out and say, this is not acceptable, I believe that we'll be in this place for a very, very long time. And nurses are absolutely key to this, because there are so many of us from all parts of the world, and we just need to support each other in this. And we're not brilliant at doing that, I'm afraid. Sorry.
No, we have a long ways to go in terms of addressing systemic racism, and it's going to take all of us, for sure. And so the next question is around English levels that are needed in English-speaking countries. So professional associations in English-speaking countries require a certain level of English to write registration exams. There is little, if any, research on what level of English acquisition equals patient safety.
Yeah.
But patient safety is usually the reason given as to the level of English required.
Yeah.
In your research or experience in the NHS, does this limit the entry of minority or ethnic backgrounds into healthcare in a way that is counter to principles of equity?
I could answer that question just by saying yes. I mean, I think that it's really very, very interesting that we use language in England to differentiate between and stop people who are potentially really very, very good clinicians from coming into the country and even taking part in being doctors and nurses and so on and so forth. That's the truth of it. You have to have a certain level of English, for sure. But what's even more interesting than that is that English-born and English-speaking people of colour still don't do well in their exams, as they are less likely to particularly medics and some nursing in some nursing schools to do it as well. So not having English is one of the factors where they actually stop people from, you know, coming into the country and doing the job of work that they need to do. You need to have a certain level of English. That's one thing. But also, if you are English and you were brought up in this country and you have a good level of English, your exam grades are still much lower than your white counterparts, and you are less likely to be able to pass your exams if you are in medicine, or even if you are in nursing, than your white counterparts. So I was looking at a piece of research recently. A colleague of mine and a friend of mine did some work. It was Kingston University, sorry. And what she found was, regardless of your, whether you were born here or you were born elsewhere, if you were a person of color, you had to apply for a job 5 times more than your white counterpart, this is in nursing, before you were accepted for a role. So language is one thing, but bigger than language is skin color, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I have a raised hand, so I'm going to ask the person with the raised hand. So that's Chi Chun Lin.
So I really enjoy the presentation. So I would like to hear more about the immigration issue. Is anything related to immigration?
Yeah, I mean, do you know what? At the moment, particularly within nursing, so we are 45,000 nurses short in the NHS. And we've gone through this thing that you might have heard of called Brexit. Brexit. And what that has meant is that many of the nurses that would have come from Europe, Spain, Germany, Portugal, so on and so forth, in the first year after the vote, the Brexit vote, the number of those nurses that were asking to come to this country went down by about 95%. So automatically we scored an own goal. So nurses decided they weren't going to come here from the EU countries. So that meant that people had to go out and look for nurses from other parts of the world, or to get nurses from this country, England, to start, we needed to start getting people into nursing places. Well, they produced many more nursing places, but unfortunately, because of another political decision, which was to raise the cost of training to be a nurse, they didn't get as many nurses as they wanted. So now, to be honest, answer the question, we are going all over the world and pillaging and pinching everybody else's nurses. That's what we're doing, because we need to have 45,000 nurses now, today, because we're 45,000 nurses short. So we're going off and finding nurses from the Philippines, nurses from India, nurses from Africa to bring into our country to do nursing. So for immigration, we are bringing people in, and they have recently dropped the entry requirements, because prior to that, yes, you do have to have a certain amount of English language, but they were saying that you had to, earn a certain amount of money, so you'd have to be a certain level. They've dropped that now, so that many more nurses can actually get in through under the wire, as it were. And come into the country. So as far as immigration is concerned, if you are a qualified nurse, registered nurse, and you can speak a modicum of English, we'll bite your hand off. We'll have you in this country at the moment, for sure. I hope that helps.
Okay, but we don't want to lose our nurses here, so you all need to we have to work harder in British Columbia.
It's a real problem worldwide, isn't it? And for a long time we were one of the countries that was saying we were not going to other places in the world and taking their nurses, particularly poor countries, because they need to have their nurses in those countries as well as we do. So we were, because we were part of the European Union, obviously we could go backwards and forwards, and it was something that we stopped going to places like India and Africa and so on and taking their nurses. That has now stopped. That has now stopped, and we are now in a place where organizations are going all over the world and looking to bring more nurses in. So it's a problem. It's a problem.
Okay, so last question. It's about your 7 A's of allyship. Yes. And what's on your must-read list about race inequities?
Do you know what? I read a lot.
Inequities, I will say.
I read a lot. It's backed by 7As, but I do read a lot, and I would recommend to people who are here a book by a woman called Afua Hirsch, Professor Afua Hirsch. That's AFUAHIRST. It's a really, really good book, and it's called Brit-ish, but it talks about being Black in Britain, and it's really interesting. And there's another one by a chap called Akala, and he has written a book, and I can't remember the name of it, but I will tell people, oh gosh, it's about being Black in England, but it's relevant to other countries as well. I've also recently read a book by Germaine Greer called British Black History. So I do read a lot about the history in Britain and what goes on and what's happened around race and so on and so forth. And I find it absolutely fascinating because people don't know the history of their own country, which is quite interesting. Because the most of this country that I'm living in during the Victorian times particularly was built on transatlantic slave trade, and people just don't know that, and it's really interesting. So on. I missed the bit about the my 7As. I heard the bit about what books would I recommend, but I missed about the 7As. Was that a question?
Yeah, no. I think they were saying that they really liked the 7As and wanted to know about the book. So that's great. So we are out of time now, I think. Is that correct? We unfortunately have to finish. But it's evening for you.
It is.
And if you were here in Vancouver, I would take you out for lunch now to eat some ramen or sushi or something like that.
Oh, wow.
But we will have you back at some other time.
Thank you.
But we really want to thank you for your work, for joining us in your evening. And I'll just turn it over to Elizabeth, who would have some final words to say.
Thank you, Sabrina. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a fabulous 50-second Marion Woodward lecture. Really some important information. I would say that many of our stats would look very similar here, except sadly, we don't capture some of that information in our national data. And that is something that has been a conversation as well. So you've given us lots to think of and some good ideas for action. And yes, the 7As of allyship as well. So thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. And this will be, has been recorded. So this will be eventually made available to a wider audience. But have a very good evening. And for the rest of you, I hope this was a great lunch and have a very good day.
Thank you all. Take care. Look after yourselves and keep safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
This concludes our Marion Woodward lecture for 2020.